Okay, in this lesson we'll work on fine-tuning some of the behaviors of our particles. So now that we have the particles set up in our scene, one of the things that we need to do is we need to make sure that these particles are actually moving along with this aircraft. So let's get in here. I'm going to press the P key on my keyboard to switch to a perspective view so that way we can get in here a little bit tighter. Okay, so what we can do is, again, we want to make sure that as this aircraft starts to lift up, that the particles are moving with it. So the particles right now are just staying in this area. So to do that, let's first find the point in space where these are sort of right together. So I'm going to go to about frame 65, 66, some point just before this aircraft starts to lift up. So it's right at its beginning point. Now with this particle emitter selected, let's go up here. Let's select this link tool here. With that selected, now let's come in here. We're going to click on this emitter. We're going to click and drag up to this point right up here. There we go. And now what we should see is these are linked together. So now as the aircraft moves, the particle emitter will move with it. Okay, very nice. So once we're done with that, we can go back to our select tool. And we want to see what this looks like. We can press the C key on our keyboard to jump back to our camera view. We're going to go to our shot camera. There we go. So now the aircraft starts to lift away. The hose pops off. The particle emission starts. Aircraft lifts away. And then the particles stop. Okay, now we have an issue here where the particles just suddenly disappear. So let's come back to our super spray. Let's go back to our particle generation rollout. And we need to take a look in the same area where in our previous lesson we adjusted the start and stop emission for our particles. We also have this option down here, display until. So this is saying that the particles will be displayed until frame 100. So you can see in my timeline, as soon as we pass frame 100, all my particles disappear. Okay, well, we really don't want that to happen. We don't want the particles to just suddenly and abruptly disappear. So let's give these a little bit more time. Let's say we want these to display up until around frame 120. There we go. That's a little bit nicer. So now these particles actually sort of emit out from the bottom and then stop. So again, these are coming to a stop right about frame 100, which is about the point where we tell it to actually stop emitting. So all in all, this is going to be, I think, pretty nice. Now, let's talk about how these particles are actually going to look when they're being rendered out. So if we come in here to a point where these particles are spraying out, in my case about frame 99, let's come in here and we'll take a quick render. So let's render production. Let's come in here and let this render out. You can see at the moment, we just see these teeny tiny little dots. They're really not showing up all that well. So what we need to do now is come in here and start to govern how these particles are going to look when they're rendered. So let's start by going up to these basic parameters all the way up at the top. And in the viewport display, we have these set to be displayed as ticks, which is these little crosshairs here. We can have these displayed as dots, or we can have these displayed as a mesh. Now, once we kick this option on, this is actually what I like to use, because whenever we use this, now we can actually see what these particles are going to look like whenever they're rendered out. You can see it's just these teeny tiny little dots. Now, we can actually control what mesh is going to be used on these particles. So, now if we scroll down toward the bottom, let's come in and open up this particle type rollout. You can see right now this is set to standard particles and set to triangle. Now we can actually control the particle size a little bit further up. This is with this size right here. So as we start to dial that up, you can see our particles get larger and larger. There we are. And if we wanted to change this maybe to something like a cube, we can actually see now our particles become cubes. We could do maybe a facing, tetra shape, 6-point, a sphere, whatever we might want. So we have lots of different options here. In the case of something like this, where we want it to be sort of maybe kind of smoky, sort of look like fog or sort of a cold steam that's coming out, in my case I like to use something like facing. In some other applications you may hear these referred to as something like billboard particles, but essentially it's just a basic plane. But the plane always stays facing toward the camera. So that way we can come in here and texture this with some kind of a texture like a smoke or a fog texture, and it will actually look really, really nice. So you can see this if I press the P key on my keyboard and swivel around. You can see, again, these are just very simple planes, and they always stay pointing toward the camera. As soon as I start to move in my timeline, these will snap and again start to face toward the camera. So this is going to be the particle type that I'm going to use. Now let's come in here, and we can start to make some alterations. So right now we have the size set to a certain size, in my case about 15. Now if we want, we can sort of start to vary the sizes, because we probably don't want these all to be exactly the same size. We want to make this look a little bit more random. So we can come in here and start to increase this variation percentage, so that way some particles are a little bit larger, some are a little bit smaller. We have full control over that. In my case, I'll probably take this Grow 4 and maybe set this a little bit lower. So maybe these only grow for about 3 or 4 frames. There you go, and with that set, we might be able to come in here and maybe knock that size down a little bit. So now these particles are going to grow for just a few frames until they reach their final size, which is going to be right about here. We also have Fade, which means that as these particles start to reach the end of their life, sort of down here, they're actually going to start to fade and start to get smaller and smaller until they just sort of blink out of existence. Okay. Now let's come in here and start to make some other alterations. Right now we have our particle life set to last about 30 frames. Now in my case, you can see the particles are lasting quite a bit longer than that, so we might want to come in here and maybe set that down a little bit lower, something like 10 or 20 frames. We can even give these a little bit of variation, so not all particles will die once they've reached the exact age of 20 frames. We can have some particles, in this case with a value of 5, some particles will die at frame 15, some will die at frame 25, so we have a 5-frame variance. And we can set that as much as we want. And again, now some particles are living a little bit longer, some a little bit shorter, just to add a little bit more variation, a little bit more randomization. Okay, we can also come in here, and for things like the speed, once again, these are moving at about a rate of 10. If we come in here, let's say maybe set that rate down to 2, you can see the particles are being emitted, but they're moving very, very slowly. In my case, you can see they're really not moving very fast at all now. We'd crank that up to something like 20 if we wanted to. You can see now our particles are going to move much, much faster through space. So whichever value you want to use, that's entirely up to you. In my case, I'll probably set this probably pretty close to the default value of 10. I kind of like the way that that looks. Maybe keep that between 8 and 10 in my case. What we can also do, just like what we've looked at, we can also add a little bit of variation, so that way not all of these particles are moving at the exact same speed. We can start to increase that variation percentage. So some of these particles will move a little bit slower, some will move a little bit faster. In this sort of a viewport, it's a little bit more difficult to see, but it, again, will sort of really just help add a little bit more natural variation and a little bit more natural chaos to these particles. Now, one thing I'd like to do before we wrap up this lesson is to add maybe just a little bit of spin to these particles. Right now, it's sort of difficult to tell because they're really just sort of moving upward, but they really have very little spin to them. So let's scroll down. This is going to be found a little bit further down. Let's open up this rotation and collision rollout. We have our spin time, which again is set to about 30. Now, right now, these particles are all going to be spinning at the exact same rate. So I want to add a little bit more randomization to this, so I'm going to add a little bit of variation. You can see, if you look very closely at my particles, this might be a little bit easier to see in something like a wireframe view. But if you look at the variation now, you can see some of these particles now are going to be rotated a little bit differently. Again, just to add a little bit more variation, we can add a little bit higher phase, so that way they start out maybe at a different rotation angle. And again, we have a little bit of variation here as well, so they don't all start out at the exact same orientation. Just trying to add a little bit more randomization, a little bit more chaos, and trying to take away some of the uniformity that these particles have as a default setting. Okay, now one of the things that we still need to address is, even though we have our particle behavior looking a lot better now, one of the things that we have is that these particles are really just sort of going straight through this ground. And we probably wouldn't want that. These particles should actually sort of be hitting the ground and sort of interacting with some way on this landing platform. So in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at particle collisions and how we can start to create these realistic collisions between particles and other objects in our scene.